I argued with God for almost 70 years, not out loud, not in churches, but quietly in my own mind every time life stopped making sense. And the strange thing is, the moment I finally stopped trying to win that argument, something in my life changed in a way I never expected. My name is Samuel Whitaker. I'm 101 years old. I spent most of my life believing something was wrong with God. That may sound strange coming from a 101-year-old man sitting quietly in his garden, but it's the truth. For decades I watched life unfold in ways that did not make sense to me. Good people suffered, honest men lost everything, families broke apart for reasons no one could explain. And every time something like that happened, I would find myself asking the same question: why? For most of my life, that question followed me everywhere. When I was young, faith seemed simple. My mother believed in God the way some people believe in sunrise. It was natural to her, certain. She never argued about it. She never tried to prove it. She just lived as though something unseen was quietly guiding things. I never had that kind of peace. Even as a boy, I wanted explanations. I wanted logic. I wanted things to make sense. And for a while, life seemed to cooperate with that way of thinking. I grew up in a small town where people worked hard and expected life to follow certain rules. If you were honest, things would work out. If you worked hard, you would succeed. If you believed in God, you would be protected. At least that's what we were told. I believed it too, until the first crack appeared. I was 19 when my older brother Daniel died. He was 24, strong, kind, the kind of man everyone trusted, the kind of man who helped strangers push broken cars off the road without being asked. And one winter night, driving home from work, a truck slid across an icy road and hit him head on. Just like that, he was gone. I remember standing at the funeral, listening to the pastor talk about God's plan, God's plan. Those words felt like sand in my mouth. Daniel had just gotten married 6 months earlier. His wife was pregnant. Their life was beginning. What kind of plan destroys something like that? That was the first time something hardened inside me. People kept saying things meant to comfort. God needed another angel. Everything happens for a reason. You must trust the Lord. But none of it made sense, and I started noticing something that bothered me more each year that passed. No one really had answers. They had phrases, they had scriptures, but not answers. So I began searching, at first quietly, then almost obsessively. Through my 20s and 30s, I read everything I could find: religion, philosophy, science, history. I talked to pastors, professors, traveling speakers who claimed to understand suffering and purpose. Every one of them seemed certain about something different. That only made things worse, because if everyone claimed to know the truth, someone had to be wrong. And slowly, without announcing it to anyone, I began stepping away from faith altogether. Not angrily at first, just disappointed. Life continued, of course. I married a woman named Eleanor when I was 28. She had a laugh that filled a room and a patience that made people feel safe around her. She believed in God too, but she wasn't the type to argue about it. If anything, she seemed curious about my questions instead of threatened by them. In the early years of our marriage, we talked about it sometimes late at night. I would bring up contradictions I had read about. She would listen quietly, and sometimes she would say something simple like, "Maybe faith isn't meant to solve everything." At the time, that irritated me. If faith didn't answer questions, what good was it? Years passed. We had 2 daughters. Life grew busy in the ordinary way. Work, bills, school events, fixing things around the house. The kind of rhythm most families fall into without thinking about it. And for a long stretch, things were fine, not perfect, but stable, which almost made me forget the questions. Almost. Then life cracked open again. Our younger daughter, Hannah, was 16 when she got sick. It started as something small: fatigue, headaches, a strange weakness that doctors couldn't explain. Weeks turned into months, tests turned into more tests. And eventually, one evening, a doctor sat across from Eleanor and me and used words no parent ever wants to hear: autoimmune disease, aggressive, unpredictable. I remember staring at the floor while he explained treatments and probabilities. Probabilities, that word still bothers me. It sounds so calm, so scientific, but behind it is chaos. We spent the next 3 years in and out of hospitals. Some months were hopeful, others were terrifying, and during those years I watched something that confused me even more than my brother's death. Eleanor prayed constantly, not dramatic prayers, not loud ones, quiet ones, sometimes in the kitchen, sometimes beside Hannah's hospital bed when she thought no one was watching. And I could never figure out why, because there were days when nothing improved, days when things actually got worse. But she prayed anyway. One night I finally asked her something that had been building inside me for years. I said, "How can you still believe when none of this makes sense?" She looked at me for a long time before answering. Then she said something I didn't understand until decades later. She said, "Faith isn't about things making sense." I shook my head. That sounded like surrender, like giving up on thinking. So I kept searching. Doctors, specialists, research papers, anything that might explain why this was happening. Because somewhere in my mind I still believed that if I could understand the system, I could fix the problem. But life does not negotiate like that. Hannah died 2 months before her 20th birthday, and something inside me collapsed. Not loudly, quietly, like a building that had been weakened for years, finally giving way. For a long time after that, I stopped asking questions, not because I had found answers, but because I was tired. Years went by. The girls were gone from the house. Work slowed down. Life grew quieter. And Eleanor remained the same, still gentle, still patient, still believing something I could not see. Then one afternoon, something small happened that changed the direction of my life in a way I never expected. I was sitting on our back porch reading a book about philosophy, one of many I had collected over the years. Eleanor came outside with 2 cups of tea. She sat beside me and asked what I was reading. I started explaining some complicated argument the author was making about the nature of suffering. Halfway through my explanation, she smiled softly, not in a mocking way, just kindly, and she asked a question no one had ever asked me before. "Sam, after all these years of searching, are you actually at peace?" The answer came out before I had time to think about it. No, not even close. In fact, the more I had studied, the less peaceful I felt, because every new idea created 10 new questions, and every unanswered question felt like another crack in the floor beneath me. Eleanor nodded slowly, then she said something that stayed with me for the rest of her life. She said, "Maybe you've been asking faith to do the wrong job." I asked what she meant, and she said, "Maybe faith was never meant to explain life. Maybe it was meant to help you live through it." That thought sat in my mind like a stone dropped into water. The ripples took years to spread, because even then I resisted it. I had built my entire understanding of the world around the idea that truth must be provable, that belief does not dissolve overnight. But slowly, things began shifting, not because I suddenly found answers, but because I started noticing something I had ignored for most of my life. People who had peace rarely had perfect explanations. and people who had perfect explanations rarely had peace. That realization unsettled me. Then one winter morning, Eleanor collapsed in the kitchen. Stroke. She survived. But something about her changed after that. She grew quieter, more reflective. We spent long evenings sitting together without speaking much. And during those quiet hours, something unexpected happened. For the first time in my life, I stopped trying to solve existence. I simply sat there, with her, with the silence, with the uncertainty. And strangely, the world did not fall apart. Months later, she said something one evening that I will never forget. She said, "You're different lately." I asked how. She smiled and said, "You're not fighting the mystery anymore." That sentence followed me for years, because she was right. For most of my life, I had been arguing with reality, demanding explanations from a universe that never promised them. And the day Eleanor died, another strange thing happened. I expected anger, questions, the same frustration I felt when Daniel died, the same rage I felt when Hannah was taken from us. But instead, there was something else, a quietness, not happiness, not understanding, but acceptance. And in that quiet, I finally realized something that had been sitting in front of me for 70 years. Faith was never supposed to answer my questions. Faith was what remained when the questions could not be answered. All those years I thought believers were avoiding the truth, but now I see something different. They weren't avoiding mystery. They were learning how to live inside it. And strangely, that is where peace was hiding the entire time, not in certainty, not in explanations, but in trust. If you had told the younger version of me that I would say something like this at 101 years old, I would have laughed at you. But life humbles a person, slowly, patiently, until eventually you stop demanding control and start paying attention instead. So if you are someone who feels frustrated because life does not make sense, I understand that feeling better than most. But maybe the goal was never to solve the puzzle. Maybe the goal was simply to walk the road without needing to see the entire map. At 101 years old, I can finally say something honestly that I could never say when I was young. I still don't have the answers, but for the first time in my life, that no longer scares me. And when I think back over everything now, the years, the questions, the arguments I carried around in my head, I sometimes wish I could sit down with the younger version of myself for just a few minutes, not to lecture him, not to prove him wrong, just to tell him to breathe, to tell him that life is going to confuse him, that things he loves will be taken, that some prayers will seem unanswered, and that he will spend many long nights trying to make sense of it all. But I would also tell him something I didn't understand back then. Peace does not arrive when every question is solved. Peace arrives when you finally stop demanding that life explain itself. When you learn to sit beside someone you love in silence without needing the moment to justify itself. When you realize that faith was never a contract promising safety or fairness. It was simply the courage to keep walking, even when the road disappears into fog. At 101 years old, I've buried people I thought I couldn't live without. I've watched dreams vanish. I've stood in hospital hallways that felt colder than winter. And yet somehow, life kept moving. The sun kept rising. Children kept laughing somewhere in the distance. And slowly, I began to see something I had missed for most of my life. Meaning isn't something you unlock with the right answer. It's something that quietly grows while you keep showing up, even when you don't understand, especially when you don't understand. So if you're listening to me right now, maybe sitting somewhere late at night with your own questions, your own doubts, your own frustrations with how life has unfolded. You're not alone in that, and you don't have to solve it all tonight. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is continue forward without clarity, to love people without guarantees, to hope without proof, to believe that even if the story doesn't make sense yet, it may still be worth living. I spent most of my life thinking faith was supposed to give me answers. Now I know something different. Faith was the thing quietly carrying me while I searched for them. Thank you for sitting with me for a while and listening to an old man's reflections. If something in this story stayed with you, let me know in the comments. I read them more often than you might think. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, you're welcome to subscribe to the channel. Sometimes the lessons that take a lifetime to understand are the ones worth sharing.